get started. Welcome everyone. Thanks for being here today. Oh yeah, sorry, I already forgot about the microphone. As usual, we will be using the microphones during the Q&A and the introduction period. Alex is already mic'd up as well. We have a very special presentation today because we have a guest on Zoom, Richard Gavin, who is the author of the story Alex will be presenting about, has been able to join us on Zoom. So welcome to Richard Gavin. Alexander Dickow will be doing today's presentation. He's professor of French in our Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Literatures. He writes in French and English. He's a poet, novelist, critic, scholar, translator, quite the list. He's currently at work on a scholarly book on French and anglophone weird fiction. And you can see his title today up on the screen. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Richard for being here and to Paul for hosting. It's really a nice opportunity to do this and to exchange with colleagues beyond MCLL and across the college. So thank you very much for being here. The title has changed a little bit, Interstitial Aesthetics, Richard Gavin's Neithernor, and the name Neithernor should technically be in quotation marks since it is a short story that I'll be talking about today. Richard Gavin is a Canadian author. He lives a little bit outside of Toronto and is very interested in weird fiction, but also the occult. So he's done a lot of reading in sort of esoteric traditions and things like that, which we can talk to if we get a chance to at the end here. So this is really a presentation of a part of chapter 2 of a monograph that I'm working on called The Ineffable Object in French and Anglophone Weird Fiction. You'll notice it doesn't say Francophone because I wasn't able to find appropriate examples that are in French from Canada or French from the Caribbean, although I do talk a little bit about a Caribbean writer who writes in French in one of the other chapters. So I'm going to start us off with the sort of the soundtrack for this particular story. The protagonist of the story, whose name is Forrest, encounters this piece when it's offered to him by his fiancée. And it's by Giacinto Scelsi, which, if you're not familiar with his work, this will be an interesting experience. Oops, sorry, advertisement. There we go. So I wish I could do a proper fade out on that, as it would be more effective, but I do want to move along a little bit. Scelsi was a composer in the 50s and 60s, something like that. He was an Italian guy who worked largely in France, if I'm not mistaken. This piece is called Anahit, which is the name of a sort of Persian Armenian goddess of fertility. And I actually got into Chelsea's work through this story. So when I encountered it in the story, I went and hunted down this piece, which I admire very much. It's very unsettling work, as you can tell from listening. And he uses a lot of microtonal devices. So you get sort of, you're not quite in your usual G sharp. You're somewhere slightly off of G sharp, and the note will sort of move between tones. Which gives it a very unsettling and sort of neither this nor that sort of quality throughout this piece. So to start, I want to situate everyone and demonstrate, talk a little bit about what weird fiction is. And weird fiction is somewhat an optional term. People talk about weird tales, or they talk about horror fiction. There are a lot of different terms, and all the canons from these neighboring genres kind of overlap. Weird fiction is considered to be very hybrid, which means that it often borrows from science fiction, it borrows from horror, it borrows from a variety of other genres. Sometimes you don't necessarily have supernatural elements in weird fiction. You might just have a very strange story. One of my favorites is a story by Michael Sisko, which involves a guy who wears a rubber monster mask. He's the neighbor, and he wears a rubber monster mask all the time. He never sees his face, and that's the story. So you get these sort of weird, uncanny moments that don't necessarily have a supernatural quality to them, or at least not explicitly so. Originally, really sort of the origin point for weird fiction is Gothic fiction with people like Anne Radcliffe or Walpole or Lewis, who wrote The Monk, things like that. Then you get Edgar Allan Poe and Hoffman, who are really sort of considered the fathers of the genre, properly speaking. Shelley is very important as well, but as I was saying earlier, there's a little bit of a tug of war with science fiction over Shelley as a sort of maternal figure. H.P. Lovecraft, M.R. James, William Hope Hodgson, these are some of the figures of the 20th century that are most closely associated with the genre. People know Lovecraft by way of Cthulhu, who's the giant squid-like god figure from Lovecraft's fiction. And nowadays you have a figure named Thomas Ligotti, who's become very important since the 1980s. Songs of a Dead Dreamer and whatnot are available in a Penguin Classics edition now, so he's considered very important. And his, like Lovecraft, he's very interested in a kind of stylistic maximalism, which is to say there's this very ornate prose. Edgar Allan Poe, of course, comes to mind in that respect as well. And that's very frequent in these stories. There's also the new weird. Right, the new weird was a phenomenon that emerged in the late 2000s, which is another sort of hybridization of weird fiction. You get things like Mieville's Perdido Street Station, and of course nowadays, this is not part of the new weird, but an example of weird fiction that people know about generally nowadays on television is Stranger Things, right? So would be qualified as weird fiction. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read this argument from chapter 2. I'm not actually going to go into Kant while I'm here. You may be relieved to hear that. But this does give, I think, a sort of a nutshell vision of the chapter as a whole. In the Critique of Judgment, Kant identifies disinterestedness as a crucial feature of pure aesthetic judgment. In Gavin's Neithernor, the narrator protagonist seems at first to display precisely this relation to a series of mysterious, unsettling sculptures. His language suggests his desires play little to no role in his interaction with these objects. In fact, he assumes an artificial attitude of detachment towards many things. But the narrator's disinterestedness reflects denial. It is a smokescreen for the desires that indeed orient his acts. This structure of detachment as denial dovetails perfectly with at least one common objection to Kant's disinterestedness. According to this objection, a pure aesthetic judgment would be difficult to find in the real world because a subject's desires typically taint the purity of aesthetic contemplation. The originality of Gavin's approach to disinterestedness and to artistic autonomy is to reimagine the aesthetic as monstrous and horrifying. In other words, disinterestedness of the kind Kant requires for universal aesthetic judgments may be called properly inhuman. It is a non-space, a conceptual whole, cold and reptilian. If so, horror might be the genre most able to envision the aporia of the aesthetic. So this position of sort of being neither focused on the ends to which you might put the work of art, nor to the pleasures that the work affords, is a kind of monstrous or inhuman space in between. Okay, Neithernor, the story, originally was published in 2015 in an anthology, which is a wonderful anthology that I highly recommend, called Aikman's Heirs, and it was republished in the collection by Gavin right here called Grotesquerie from 2016, so just 1 year between the pre-publication and the publication. It was also reprinted in a journal called The Dark at one point online. And a possible intertext is a story by Robert Aikman, another interesting figure of the weird, called The Swords, in which we have a very strong example of sexual ambivalence. We have a scenario where a character shows up to a little fair, he goes in a tent, and a barker presents a woman and a pile of swords. And men go up, all men, go up one by one to the stage, and they stab the woman with the sword. And she doesn't appear to object to this at all. It doesn't bother her, it doesn't kill her, it doesn't do any violence to her. She smiles, and then they kiss her passionately. And then they remove the sword and they put it back and they go back to their spot. And this happens over and over again. And later we find out that the protagonist of the story has a sort of, the barker who's involved in the performance is literally pimping out this young woman who appears on stage, and she turns out to be so passive during the relationship or the relation with the protagonist that the protagonist accidentally pulls her hand off, right? And there's this kind of like revulsion related to sexuality in this throughout the story that turns up again in Neithernor in the shape of the ambivalence of the main character, notably towards his fiancée. And this is Forrest's description of his fiancée. The next event was my becoming engaged to a woman named Kara. I am to blame entirely for the romance. Kara was a clerk at the music shop that sat between the Mirror office, which is where he works, and my smoke-damaged home. For a period of a month, perhaps longer, I incorporated a stop at the music store into my lunch hour routine. Kara was not the reason for my frequent visits, though she would likely say otherwise. I was simply trying to not merely replenish, but actually improve my lamented record collection, and the shop's location was convenient. My guilt in this crime of the heart was ordering Tchaikovsky, which women almost always equate with sensitivity. He is my own concession to the delicate, and it cost me. What shall I say about our courtship? We talked, and Kara made recommendations of records I did not buy. Somehow we ended up at a cafe, and later in her bed, and much later in a townhouse that we shared. As to who proposed to whom, my recollection is foggy, but Kara insists that I asked her in a manner that was endearingly shy. This is the version she tells her friends and her mother. I suppose this version is accurate enough. So he's clearly very, very detached, and you might interpret this as a kind of revulsion as well towards his fiancée, right? He doesn't quite buy into their relationship. There's no buy-in here. But we also might consider this a case of denial. He actually denies the actual love that he feels for Kara, and therefore is willing to sort of cover over his involvement in getting them involved in the first place, right? His implication in that. So obviously there's a lot of sort of alienated sexuality in this story and in a lot of weird fiction stories that I've been looking at in my monograph. So this is the ambivalence that comes from The Sword, since Aikman's Heirs is really reflecting on the legacy of Aikman, and that story seems to me to play at least a partial role in understanding the ambivalence of the main character. So we encounter the Forrest encounters the Neithernor sculptures. The person responsible for them is his cousin Vera, which is how he finds out about the exposition that he goes to find Vera's sculptures. And obviously he starts the story by saying, I was very distant from Vera, I didn't know her. And we of course immediately suspect more denial, that he's actually sort of sexually fascinated by Vera, and that motivates his going to see the Neithernor sculpture exposition. And he says, I moved further down the gallery's aisle, pausing to study an especially complex and delicate-looking piece that sat between the smudgy glass of a display case. That the carousel you're looking at? The proprietor asked, returning his hanky to the inside of his vest. "A keen eye you've got, sir. I'm fond of that one myself." I nodded. Yes, I suppose it is a carousel at that. Truth be told, I thought it was a scorpion at first." He chortled. "That's the rub of it. That's Miss Elan's gift. You see, your eye's sharper than most, I dare say. She calls the series Neithernor because they are neither one thing nor the other. One sees two things at once, you might say. Take that one, for example. For the longest time, I thought that one represented a handheld mirror. Then a young lady from one of the universities nearby told me that it was most definitely an Egyptian ankh. Now I don't know which it is. I tell you, the funny thing is, when I leave here at night, I will often think about Ms. Elan's work while I'm cooking my supper or lying in bed about to sleep. I think of it, but I can never remember exactly what these pieces look like. Isn't that a puzzler?" Forrest says at the beginning of the story that he has a holy memory, Holey, and we also note that he can't remember who proposed to whom with Kara. So he clearly also has a kind of hole in his memory. He's missing something important, which is what Kara, when she finally leaves, which of course she does, will then reproach Forrest with lacking something fundamental, right? And we don't know what it is. The sort of very Lacanian kind of narrator. And the sculptures are always ambivalent. They connote kind of opposite things. The carousel we associate with sort of childhood family moments, and the scorpion, which of course is a venomous creature. So the Neithernor sculptures are objects of dread and also morbid seduction. When he gets involved with these sculptures, he then sort of mobilizes them. He offers one to his fiancée, which turns out to be a disaster. The fiancée is like, "Ew, what's that?" and runs away. Basically, it says, I don't know who you are, mister, but I'm not going to be involved with you anymore." They're made of copper wire and human hair, and they're eerie objects in the sense of Mark Fisher. Mark Fisher is an important scholar of the weird who died some years ago, who wrote a book called The Weird and the Eerie, in which he talks about the eerie as being either a failure of presence or a failure of absence. It's something that is there but shouldn't be, or something that isn't there but should be. So I think in particular of late at night if you go to a playground and there are no children on the swings, but the swings are creaking in the wind, right? There should be children there playing, but we have this terrible absence in the playground. Or finding a cradle in the attic, right? A dusty old cradle in the attic. You're like, yeah, right? So these are eerie objects. And clearly these Neithernor sculptures are sort of not quite present. They don't have a fullness of presence, which is why they're so easily forgotten by the, I was going to say the Barker because he resembles the Barker from the Swords, but from the gallery proprietor who presents the Neithernor sculptures to the world. And they demonstrate Forrest's persistent denial. So he never recognizes that he's fascinated by these objects as well as by Vera, who created them. He never states whether he finds the Neithernor sculptures attractive or repellent, and he leaves much of his thoughts about these ambivalent objects out of the story entirely, which is a tendency in this story. His memory is holy, but as well the story has these weird sort of little holes in it. He can't remember how he ended up in bed and living with Kara, for example. Right? He has no memory of these things, like his memory is tainted. Okay, then there's a scene with the monster, right? There is a monster in this story, as there is in many weird fiction stories, though not all. And what characterizes the monster is interstitiality, according to Noel Carroll, who wrote a book called Philosophy of Horror. Interstitiality being the state of being between, right? And interstitial monsters might be monsters that sort of combine categories that are not supposed to be associated. So you get, a creature with a bird's head and the tail of a monkey or something, whatever. Different categories are mixed. And here we have, in its purest state, the sculptures themselves that really stand in for the monstrous here, the interstitial monster. They produce both fascination and loathing, and there's a little bit of a discussion about whether these are separate sentiments that interact in some way or whether they're one sentiment. I'm thoroughly of the conviction that we feel both fascination and horror as one sentiment when we're confronted with such sort of contradictory objects, hence part of the appeal of horror fiction or weird fiction. here is one of the things that makes Gavin's story so ingenious to my mind is the reduction of the monster to interstitiality itself, right? It doesn't have a sort of site in the story so much as it just appears everywhere in the story. There are even tiny little stylistic gestures that demonstrate this sort of neither-nor quality. As I dreaded, this is when he breaks in to find Vera to the proprietor's apartment. As I dreaded, Vera was sealed up within the tiny closet. Her slight frame rested on the metal stool, and for a beat I thought she was sleeping, until I noticed that her eyes were open yet rolled up in her skull like one in an epileptic throe. Her mouth gaped. In her hands she held it, the spool of copper wire. The glinting strand was taut before her like a fishing line in the deep. It fed backward above her head and onto the tiny hatch. This time the tiny door in the wall was unlocked and ajar. A fat band of shadow concealed whatever was rutting inside that cubby. Whatever it was, it possessed strength enough to tear at Vera's hair, which caused her somnambulistic body to heave up and then drop down again onto the stool. Her scalp was missing much more than the knitted cap. She was wearing a knitted cap earlier in the story. So we have this scene of the Pythia, right, who's the sort of the Greek Delphic oracle figure, right, who taps into the divine in order to pronounce an oracle. And we also have a scene of religious ecstasy as well as a scene of violation, right? So we have all this wrapped into one scene with the appearance of the monster, which is not really an appearance so much as an appearance as hidden, right? The monster has a bar of shadow in front of it that hides it. Which is where I bring in another, it's not quite a concept, it's more of an operator or a process or something called le neutre, which is from Maurice Blanchot, who was a theorist, literary theorist who developed this concept along with a number of other figures. Renaud Barthes talks about le neutre in one of his Collège de France lecture series, for example. It can mean either neuter or neutral, both of which are quite relevant in this context since sexuality has so much a part to play in the story. And neither nor is an expression that actually the scholar translator Anne Smock, who's translated Blanchot, uses to describe what le neutre might be. Le neutre is not a concept so much as a sort of conceptual outside that determines how actual concepts play out in Blanchot's text. But it's very, very hard to get a handle on what it is as a concept. You really can't. It's sort of amorphous. It's associated with that which is indicated without being disclosed. This is a quote from Blanchot directly describing what le neutre might be or not be, or somewhere in between being and not being. A negative grounding principle is one of the ways that I refer to this. And this, of course, all resembles, in my opinion, how the monster is presented as hidden in the story, right? We have sort of a covering up of the monster, which is there but not quite there. It's also related to, le neutre is related to negative definitions of the divine, for example, in the pseudo-Dionysius, in the divine names, right, who uses a method of sort of subtracting divine qualities in order to get at what the Godhead might be beyond those definitions. So we're talking about the apophatic rhetoric of that period. But you also find that in things like Deleuze and Guattari, who use plenty of sort of, this concept is not this, not this, not this, not this. It's something else, right? And he doesn't sort of we never get what it is, but he subtracts all of the qualities you might assume are associated with whatever concept he's talking about, like the becoming animal, for example. And he subtracts the concepts you might associate with that until you get something else, right? So that's a typical strategy. I'm talking 60s, 70s French literary theory. So I'm interested in le neutre, which is sort of more or less where I'm going to stop so that we can talk a little bit with Richard, I hope, that it provides an understanding of the relationship between the Neithernor sculptures and negativity, right? So we've been talking a lot about holes in this story, aporia, lack, et cetera, and it's my contention that le neutre shows us sort of what neither norness, if you like, has to do with negativity, right? What's Why do we frame this in terms of negativity as opposed to positivity? There's a great deal more that I talk about in this chapter, and we're certainly welcome to talk about Kant or whatever else you'd like to talk about, but I did want to leave enough time to talk with Richard and to discuss some of these ideas amongst ourselves. Thank you.
I can just say a word or two about our special guest, Richard Gavin, as well. Obviously, we know him as the author of Neithernor, as we've just been discussing. He's also the author of numerous other stories, which have been collected in book form, published in magazines, as well as in anthologies like The Best New Horror and Year's Best Horror. So we want to thank Richard Gavin for joining us via Zoom today, and we're really interested in hearing what you've got to share. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, and thank you for that excellent presentation. It was a lot of deep dives, and I'm amazed at how much you were able to extract from the story, and some of which I probably wasn't even conscious of putting into the work. But by and large, a lot of the effort that I put in to Neithernor was picked up on and really explored in this presentation. So much of what was discussed from notions of the apophatic, the absence, that sort of frustration that we feel with the idea of negativity, of empty space, of lack of presence, is integral to my work. Because by and large, I think that the experience of the numinous, or the experience of the uncanny, all these things that are evoked in weird fiction, it is sometimes better left undescribed. I think it really does, because what we're really trying for is the ineffable, and your mention of the swords, I mean, clearly was one of the main Aikman stories I was thinking of, because Neithernor was originally written as a tribute story to Aikman. So through that, the swords, it was a deeply unsettling story. It was one of the first Robert Aikman tales that I read, and as was described, the plot was so deeply unsettling to me. The idea of this woman in a tent that was basically just served as this object for these men who came in and acted violence on her. And I thought that was so unsettling. So what I did with Neithernor is that the character of Forrest was really designed to be not only the sort of proverbial unreliable narrator. There was reliability. It was also just that he was so detached and self-absorbed that he was basically a thoroughly unlikable person, but an interesting character study and an interesting way to kind of delve into the fact that even those people who claim to be, or in many instances may well be, self-obsessed, there is a lack of self-awareness. So therein there is this strange paradox where they're almost obsessed with something that they don't even understand about themselves. So the concept of the Neithernor sculptures themselves also was an homage, or a way of me incorporating the magical art of Austin Osman Spare. And if you're not familiar, Austin Osman Spare was a 20th century English artist and occultist, and he developed quite early in his artistic career. He was sort of regarded as a proto-surrealist, although Spare himself kind of bristled a little bit at that description. But nevertheless, one of the things that fascinated him was a concept of where he could take two unrelated objects and make of them he referred to it as a neither. So a famous example of this work was he was commissioned by an English publisher to create a bookplate for one of their publications. And at first glance, what he sketched looked like a standing floor lamp, a reading lamp. But when you look closer at it, it's actually comprised of the bodies of many dead birds. So it's both. It is both this image of an arrayed selection of these bird cadavers and also a lamp. And the reason that Spare approached concepts this way is that he felt that when you're confronted with something that is recognizable as two different things, it almost forces you to hold two thoughts at the same time, to kind of be flung from certainties about things to where reality suddenly becomes a little bit more fluid. So those are the kinds of things that I tried to incorporate in the story, without really delving too deeply into a kind of overt story about, say, black magic or something like that. Just really the kind of encounter with this absence and this kind of, as I refer to it, as having a holy memory, Holey, this sort of making do with gaps through one's life, and putting it through the lens of a character that, even in their conduct and the way that they treat the other characters in the story, you as the reader are really not even sure. Am I supposed to resonate with this person? He's sort of talking to me in this tone where, as if I would understand or empathize with his own views on things, but I don't. I feel a kind of there's something that hitches in me with this, where I don't quite like or even understand where this person is coming from. And I think like I said, many of the points and the subtext of the story was really beautifully articulated in this presentation. So I'm more than happy to talk a little bit more, or if you have questions, I'm happy to answer those or try to answer those.
Other questions? I was going to add to that the idea. Oh, go ahead. I'll let you start.
Hi, thank you very much. I guess I just had a comment or suggestion, and also I am interested. I'm a philosopher, so I'm interested in talking about Kant and the disinterestedness stuff and how you interpret it. And I don't know much about Kant's aesthetics, but I'm just curious to hear a bit more about that stuff. The first is that so I don't work on anything related to this stuff, but I was surprised that as you were talking, themes of the short story reminded me of themes that have emerged elsewhere in things I read maybe a while ago. But something I read recently that I was reminded of was Olga Raven's *The Employees*, which maybe is an instance of weird fiction. I don't know much about weird fiction, but there too, one of the central themes is like these weird sculptures that I think actually, and they're real sculptures, like this exhibit that inspired the novel, the short novel, the novella, I think. So if you haven't checked out Olga Raven's *The Employees*, I highly recommend it. I thought it was very weird. Also, if you're into like sculptures and like these sorts of weird conceptual lacks, that's very much. And what's weird, I was also reminded because when you said that they like the sculptures in this story imbue the sort of relation between objects of dread and morbid seduction, that's also like a very central theme in *The Employees*. So you should totally check it out. It was a very strange novella. Yeah, so maybe I'll like stop there and we can talk later about other things. I was thinking about like other instances of weird fiction that I was reminded of. Like I'm especially interested in like feminist weird fiction, and like one that came to mind where like a central theme is like has to do with ambivalence and sexual ambivalence is like Kristen Rapinian's Cat Person that came out like 5 years ago. I think that was like an interesting case. And it's like really interesting to think about how that ambivalence is like generated by feminist themes. So like ones that like Simone de Beauvoir talks about with respect to like woman's inclination to make herself into like a pure object. And I'm just like, I guess in general, I'm interested in how like the broader themes that apply more broadly, how they get instantiated into like women's attitudes. And like, you know, people in philosophy will theorize about this in terms of like the allure of self-objectification. So I don't know, that's one thing I was thinking about. But then, yeah, I'm just interested in Kant. Well, how do you, like, I don't think Kant's thinking about monsters. He's right. You don't either. Okay. Yeah. What is he thinking about? What is his point about disinterestedness and its centrality in like that moment of awe or pure aesthetic experience? How do you read him?
How do I read him? So I think I have a fairly typical understanding of Kant in that he's trying to carve out a space between and a use of work of art, right? Something can be useful. You see the pomegranate and it's good to eat, right? So you eat it, right? What something is good for versus when something is pleasant, right? It pleases our senses. That it tastes good. The green of the Dutch master's leaves is very pretty, and that's what he calls charms, right? The charms of a work of art. But the beautiful is something else. Beautiful sits somewhere in between these, because if we're pleased by it, then we're not impartial about whether it's beautiful or not. And if we are using it for something, we're also not being impartial about whether it's beautiful or not, right? Which is why you can actually read Kant in such a way, and there's an essay that does this quite nicely, that the conceptual works of the late 20th century are really quite Kantian in outlook, to the extent that their beauties are not sensuous beauties, right? They're not beauties of, you look at Index 01, for example, which is the example used by Art and Language in the 70s or 80s or something. Maybe later than that, I don't remember the date. In any case, it's like a bunch of filing cabinets, right? It doesn't have a sort of sensuous appeal at all, but it might be beautiful in terms of the way that it puts ideas together, right? And allows for what he calls a free play of the faculties, right? Which is sort of the game of imagination that starts when you look at a work of art, and that has no clear ending, right? If you're problem solving, the cognitive process has an end, right? You solve the problem or you abandon the problem, right? And it's over. But with the free play of the faculties, there's no sort of end point that you reach. So one of the problems with talking about Kant is that from it is derived what's called aesthetic attitude theory, which has been largely dismissed since the 1950s. George Dickow wrote a very important paper called The Myth of the Aesthetic Attitude, which is to say that impartiality is not an attitude. It's not the quality of the attention that you're paying to the work of art. You can be impartial about a work of art even if you're just glancing at it and walking by. Right? And you might say, "Oh, that's beautiful. I affirm that is beautiful," and it should, everyone should recognize it as beautiful. And then you walk by and you've spent 3 minutes looking at the painting, right? Or you can spend hours intently studying the painting, right, in an attitude of rapt attention, and that's not, that can yield an impartial judgment or not. According to the process that you go through, whether you're merely charmed by its sensuous qualities or whether you see the relationships in a deeper way in the work and you affirm that it's beautiful. So he's trying to ground something that would be a judgment that is, what is the expression again? Subjective universal validity is what he wants, which is to say that something that I feel, right, I affirm as being, as everyone ought to feel the same way, right, about the work of art. And he's trying to get at that, which, right, if it's just something that pleases you, you can like peanut butter or you can not like peanut butter. That has nothing to do with anything universalizable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. It just seems a bit implausible to me to characterize pure aesthetic judgment in terms that it's completely divorced from aesthetic enjoyment, right? It's just, that's such a radical claim. And I don't mean to say that there isn't a concept in the vicinity that's really important. For instance, a concept which allows us to capture the extent to which it's rational for everyone to find this thing beautiful in a way that does divorce it from subjective entertainment or experience, the pleasure derived from the aesthetic experience. I'm just surprised that he wants to characterize pure aesthetic judgment in that way.
The thing is, he doesn't make the claim that there's much pure aesthetic judgment in the world.
I see.
It's all de juris argumentation, right? He's talking about sort of the ideal conditions for the judgment of a work of art don't have anything to do with how we actually judge works of art, in which we're constantly charmed by the sensuous appeals of the work of art, and we think that that makes for a beautiful judgment. He's saying, actually, we can't make a subjectively valid claim from that because it's impure, but right. But that's how things work in the world.
Okay, cool.
I was gonna do you see any sort of parallels or similarities between what he's doing there with aesthetic judgment and then what he does with categorical imperative? Because both of them seem to be functioning, or at least intending, towards a similar kind of disinterestedness, right? So is there any sort of consideration there in terms of, or maybe it's not even part of the argument with regards to Kant's, the way you're using or thinking about Kant's aesthetic disinterestedness, but in terms of its, like you said, its functionality as kind of a conceptual lens, it seems like there's a parallel between what he's trying to do there with disinterestedness and then what he's doing with the categorical imperative in terms of objective, universal, ethical norms, or even then they are like a conceptual tool to identify those norms that are categorically imperative.
The difference is that's an objective universal, right? Which means that it has to do not with how I feel about something, but rather with objects in the world and that sort of thing. So it's a slightly different problem there. I admit that I don't know the second critique very well, so I should really look at it more and see if I can understand that parallel a little more. But to my mind, use is, if you're thinking about something in terms of how it may be used, you are looking at it in an interested way by definition, right? You're looking at it in terms of what purpose it can serve.
I have a different kind of question, if that's okay. So I noticed on your list of examples of the weird genre, stranger things appeared. So that got me to thinking about how well weird fiction is converted from the page to the screen. Does it lend itself well to visual representation? Is it easier to write weird fiction that's on the screen versus the page?
There's a very interesting theorist who talks about two forms of weird fiction. One is narratives of indetermination, and the other is narratives of monstration or revelation, right? Which is to say that I think weird fiction on television is very interested in showing you the monster, right, to terrify you, right? And that's the logic of the story. And he talks about H.P. Lovecraft in much the same terms, right? You reach the end of the story and, oh my God, deep ones, right, or whatever it is, Cthulhu. Whereas in stories that work more in the way that Neithernor works, right, it's about not showing. It's about leaving you with doubts and uncertainties, right? And so I find that very useful to understand different modes of weird fiction. I think they compete with one another. I think you can find elements of both in some works and whatnot. But television definitely lends itself to that, like in your face, like here's the monster, kind of logic. And the monsters they made for Stranger Things are really quite something. They're, this flower mouth thing is just wonderful.
I'm going to share a couple thoughts that I hope will add up to a question or two. I was thinking during the description of the sculptures, I was in my head thinking about different parallels, and the example you gave of the lamp / bird cadaver was interesting. But my head went to something a little bit more mundane, which was does anybody remember that viral dress from 10 years ago of you see it in 2 different colors or whatever, and that experience was everybody was trying to see it both ways in a way. You see it one way, and then you're divided from your peers in that, and that experience is a little bit unsettling. And then you're kind of trying to bridge that gap and see it from their perspective, and vice versa. And so I'm wondering if there are other things from just daily experience that come to mind. And that like are analogs here. I also relatedly have a somewhat selfish question, because I'm working on a paper of myself right now that's about climate fiction, so like, you know, climate change related science fiction, and using Raymond Williams' concept of structures of feeling. You know, he uses this term to capture that. You know, he was working within literary analysis and the sociology of literature, but to talk about how these different stylistic and affective elements of prose or literature at a given period feel very personal, but they're also like connected to an overarching quality of experience that typifies that, like the era that they're being produced within. So I'm interested to hear either of you sort of reflect on the broader genre, where this story fits in with it, what themes are connected to other themes that show up elsewhere, which we've heard a little bit about, and maybe how those relate to some of the characteristic aspects of our quality of experience right now.
Richard, would you like to talk about some of that?
Sure, definitely. Yeah, I think in terms of how this story sort of fits in terms of a chronology or a cultural chronology, I think I didn't specify the specific era, but I do think it is an earlier era. In my mind, I sort of pictured it as kind of being in the 1950s, again, partly because that was when Aikman himself was writing. So I was sort of putting myself in that sort of mindset of an earlier era, and how the mores of culture and things like that, they infiltrate. I was really enjoying the discussion of Kant a moment ago, because I think it also plays into what one of the themes that it can be a source of frustration or alienation or unsettling, which is this idea that, well, if I strive for objectivity, if I can somehow remove any sort of subjective filters from whether it's a work of art or a relationship or the world in general, then I'll understand it. Then I'll have some measure of control over this thing, or control over my own reaction to the world and all that the world contains. And I think that is as much of a it's as much of it, I don't want to say dead end, but it can be just as much of a hindrance as someone who is perhaps overly subjective and projects their own kind of perceptions and views onto the views of other people or other cultures, other eras. So I think that basically what it really comes down to is the ineffable, that which can't be seen, that which can't be understood, that which maybe cannot even be fully conceived, is not necessarily a riddle that has to be solved. I think that it's something that we encounter, and just that the idea that, well, I have to codify this, I have to understand this, otherwise it's going to impact me in ways that I maybe don't understand, which is very much the character of Forrest is very much of that kind of mindset where, his world is a certain way, everything in his life has its place, and he has this very kind of compartmentalized, detached, cold view of the world. But the reason why I incorporated Chelsea as a composer and some of the other works of art and the sculptures is that this then factors into the idea of art, where music would be, in Chelsea's view, was kind of the music of the spheres. He always viewed himself as someone who basically just was the conduit for the music that he presented to the world. It was not a product of his own private imagination, but was something that he almost received. And that opens up a whole other area as well into this idea of, not necessarily having that kind of pure critique or that pure understanding, but if there is something that is objectively, let's say, good art, good music, what are those qualities? How do we as an audience or as a conduit or creator of that how do we factor that in? How do we sort of incorporate that and translate it? I mean, so much of art is kind of translating the ineffable and the invisible into some kind of relatable form, whether it's a story or a film or a painting. And it's a strange paradoxical realm, and that's why I incorporated the concept of art in Neithernor, was to basically show that even that, there's the notion that sometimes the person that is least capable of explaining the meaning behind a work of art is the artist. We have people like Alex who come in and are able to view the piece and really kind of get at the bedrock and a lot of the things that, as I mentioned, even I didn't even have in my consciousness when I was creating it. So it's a really fascinating process of kind of engaging with that sort of perennial mystery that I think weird fiction in particular evokes and points to and tries to instill, even if it is in a kind of mundane everyday setting where perhaps the story has no overt supernatural elements. It can still evoke that sense of the uncanny, which I think instills in the audience that sense of the mystery. So I hope that touches on some of those questions to a degree.
Yeah, thank you, Alex and Richard for joining us and really provocative set of questions that I think, like Mercy said, just really they pull so much from my own kind of reading and viewing. And so I have a kind of a meta question, perhaps for both of you, and I'll start just with the question, like, who is weird fiction for? Right, so kind of more of a reception type of question. I mean, I love the kind of let's unpack this and think of all of its various component parts, because I'm even thinking that at one point Alex mentioned Maurice Blanchot, and it reminded me of kind of an very early sort of, I don't know if it qualifies as weird fiction, but certainly a horrible story with all of these elements of sex and the uncanny. And violence, but not quite explicit violence. George Bataille's Story of the Eye, which is sort of like a late 20s, like kind of picking up on like the Marquis de Sade's sort of efforts almost 100 years before that. But how much, so many of the kinds of images that came to mind, whether it's the films of Guillermo del Toro, Stephen King's fiction. Any number of writers from all over the world. Dostoevsky came up to mind at least 3 times, right?
Kafka.
Sure, right?
Cronenberg.
The whole genre of whatever we call existential. Is this existential literature of a genre or a subgenre of weird fiction, right? But it also helped me think about kind of my own experience. I have as Alex knows, I have a 10-year-old at home who, found my copy of the collected works and poems of Edgar Allan Poe and immediately asked, like, "Hey, can I read this?" And I'm like, "Absolutely not, not yet." Right? Not because they're not capable of reading it, but that sort of untapped darkness, right? And maybe that's a normative assumption on my part, right? Makes it so that, yeah, you're going to get it, like maybe, but are you going to get it, right? I almost feel like showing them the Treehouse of Horror version, right, of The Raven before, for those of you who remember that, before kind of letting them into that sort of world. But then I kind of take a step back and I'm like, well, but why not, right? Like, because I was that bookish kid that, 12, 13, right? I was reading sort of young adult teen horror, right? Which is more about the uncanny than it is about showing kind of the monster, right? So that's sort of a long-winded way of that question of like, who is weird fiction for? And we mentioned at least a couple times the type of literature that's about the future, right? So the end of the world. Mm-hmm. But is there a genre of weird fiction that's also kind of about the pre-modern past, if that sort of formulation makes sense? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a couple of answers to that. First of all, Bataille I deal with in the chapter. Bataille's in there. This calls for it, for sure. Weird fiction is in part, I think, for people who seek for some kind of religious mystery in their experience of the world and don't find it elsewhere. Or, the book that I'm reading right now is Rudolf Otto's Das Heilige, on the sacred, which, of course, the term numinous comes from there. The term numinous being sort of the experience of the other, the holy other, transcendent, sacred object or something would be the sacred, the numinous. And what else? There was another thing I wanted to answer, and I'm trying to remember. Oh yeah, the thing about Celeste and what she's reading and that sort of thing. It's, I mean, the ideas of death and things like that are in there, I think, are certainly disquieting. I think if my daughter suddenly wanted to read Poe, I would say yes, and then we'll talk about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, I think that's the way to go. Maybe she's seeking that kind of experience, the eeriness, that kind of thing. Hava loves, my daughter loves Halloween and everything associated with it.
And they're getting it from other cultural sources,
Yeah.
right? Like whether it's Netflix or whether it's the books in their own library, right?
Yeah.
Like it's there for a young or a tween kind of audience now.
But I mean, one of the core contentions in this monograph is that the religious experience is something that people are seeking in the weird, because the interest in horror fiction really starts with the rise of secularism. I mean, we see it, Gothic stories, and then it starts to amplify into your local slasher flick, in the late 20th century. So to my mind, that's really a really core piece of weird fiction, is its connection to the religious. And people who are perfectly secular but who seek something. One of the interesting things that Otto says is that it's the most primitive form of religion is the thing that we look for in the ghost story, right? And it's sort of if you don't have institutional religions, well, you still have that sort of animistic impulse to look for mystery in the daily and that sort of thing.
Thank you. Our time is almost up, and I want to do a little bit of advertising before we break here. For Humanities Week next week, we've got an exciting roster of events, which is actually going to start a week from now right here with our usual seminar session, this time with a presentation by Shannon Bell from Sociology. Then we've got various other lectures to look forward to in the week, including Blair Kelly, who's the new director of the National Humanities Center. Keynote speech by Beth Macy, the local best-selling author. That's going to be next Tuesday evening. And then I've been trying to think whether this fits with some of what we've been talking about today. Maybe a different spin-off from the horror genre writ large, which is a parody of the hillbilly slasher flick, Tucker and Dale versus Evil. If you have not seen the movie, it is hilarious, but also very revealing about Appalachian stereotypes and that kind of thing. So we've got a free screening of Tucker and Dale versus Evil a week on Wednesday at 7 p.m. at the Lyric, with a discussion that's going to be led by our beloved colleague and Appalachian Studies expert, Emily Satterwhite. And there are various other events as well. I encourage you to take a look at the website. I placed a few flyers at the back of the room, just where Lily's sat. If you want to take a look at what's on offer, and grab one if you like. We don't have many copies with us, but again, everything is on the website, so please feel free to take a look at what's on offer. We're asking people to register. It's not required, but it gives us a good sense of who's coming to what. So please do that, and please bring your friends and colleagues and students and anyone else you can think of to Humanities Week events. And that's all. That's the advertising done with. So all that remains is one final round of applause to both our presenters for a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Okay. I'll wait for Joe to help me unplug and stuff.
Yeah, that was really good. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really fun.
Yeah, I think I really enjoy each week such a different topics, and so there are some themes that kind of run through, but very different takes.
Yeah.
My favorite is when people kind of reveal disciplinary approaches and
Yeah.
solutions.